This week is a very special and sacred week in the Australian calendar, as we all gather in remembrance for those sons and daughters of Australia who have fought in global conflicts around the world. The Honourable Michael Sukkar, our local Member of Parliament, penned these words this week. He said, "Our national spirit of remembrance has found a home on Anzac Day, which marks the brave and fateful moment in 1915 when 16,000 Australian troops landed at Gallipoli. The spirit was reinforced on the Western Front and battles of subsequent conflicts such as World War II and the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Many words are associated with Australians at war and on peacekeeping missions. Bravery, camaraderie, mateship, service, loyalty, honour, heroes and heroines. But there is one common word, one goal that brings them all together: peace. This Anzac Day, we remember and give thanks for the service of all those who have fought for our freedoms, and we give thanks to those serving our country today. This morning, as we start our message, I'd like to particularly honour those in our community who have served and continue to carry and embody the spirit of the Anzacs as we remember them this week. So in starting our time this morning, and in memory of those and honour towards those who have served, if you're able to, I'm going to invite you to stand. We're going to take a minute's silence in joining with our community over this week. So if you're able to stand, I invite you to do that, and we're just going to take a minute just to remember and give respect in this space. It's going to be an actual minute, so let's pause. Lest we forget. Thanks, everyone. It's for taking that moment to pause and to honour those in our community who have served in that way. Remembrance is an important thing. To take moments to stop and to remember and to pause, it's an important thing. And it's so easy for us as in an individual society to so heavily focus on our personal experiences, our personal lived experiences, that we become so me-centric, where my life becomes about me, whereby we're governed by what we feel, and that defines for us what is true. What intentionally stopping and remembering does is it helps embed us in a bigger narrative that is so much greater than ourselves. It has the ability to unite us together as a community and to honour and reflect upon not just an event, but also the lessons, values, costs and sacrifice of those who have gone before. As we remember this, that our stories are not our own, but they're carried together and they're passed on from one generation to the next. This week we will gather and remember the sacrifice of the Anzacs, and I encourage us all to join with our broader community on Tuesday, to stand together and collectively remember the sacrifice and service of those that have helped secure the freedoms that we share, because remembrance is an important thing. And remembrance is an important thing that we see throughout the whole of the Bible. It's something that God calls his people to be a people who remember. And he does this through things like calling us to build altars, to have feasts and festivals of celebration, to go on pilgrimages, to have religious practices, whether it was through the religious practice of the Jewish people, through circumcision or through sin offerings and stuff like that, or the repetition of religious prayers. They all call us to this place of remembrance. We read verses such as Exodus that says, in Exodus 12, "This day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout the generations, as a statute forever, you shall keep it as a feast. Or in Joshua 4, as they've crossed the river Jordan, God calls the tribes, one member of each tribe, to go into the Jordan, take a stone out and to bring it and to lay it down to serve as a sign among you, that in the future your children may ask, what do these stones mean? And then you can tell them. You can tell them that it was the Lord who stopped the flow of the Jordan before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and were able to cross. These points of remembrance. We see Jesus at the Last Supper saying, do this in remembrance of me. Remembrance is important. God is about remembering. It's about remembrance. But today I actually want to be quite forward with us as a community, with everyone. That as we finish off our time going through our Easter season, that as we finish looking at this intentional part about the death and resurrection of Jesus, I feel like God is saying to us to not stop at remembrance. Don't stop there. Don't just settle with remembering what God has done. See, Jesus' death and resurrection is not an event that happened, but a reality to be lived and to be shared. Don't settle with remembering. He's calling it to live it out. It's an experience for us to share together. So that's what we're going to talk about today. The resurrection is an experience to be shared and not something just to be remembered. Like, if I said it like this, like, I love Megan, right? I love Megan. She's incredible. The care that she puts in through the small details to love others and to show them, the intricate things that she notices and the small organizational things she does to show value to them, the intentionality in these acts, it's huge. She constantly sacrifices herself to try to make people feel loved and valued. It's amazing. I love it. I love what Megan does in those spaces. Hence why I married her, right? Now, if I had to wake up every day and you said, how's it going with Megan? Yeah, I wake up every day and I'm like, oh, yeah, I remembered I married Megan 6 years ago. Oh, yeah, I should do something about living my life in light of that, right? If I said that, you go, something's wrong. That isn't what it's meant to be like. No, because of the event 6 years ago when I married Megan, everything changes. That isn't an event to be remembered. It's a new reality that I step into, that I live. I don't have to remember an event of old because now there's a new way of living, a new experience and a new life. So too is it with the resurrection. This isn't an event that just happened and that we reflect upon. No, it's a new reality that God is calling us to live out of. The resurrection is a way of life. A new reality for us to experience every day. Remembrance is important, but God's calling us not to settle and stop there when it comes to what He has done. And to understand what this means, to understand what it looks like, I think we need to understand a little bit about what God's been doing through human history, because He's inviting us into this story. It's an important part of the greater story that He's up to. That in love, God creates the world as a place for intimacy and connection with Him. He wants us to be connected, and humanity, He creates each of us in His image, which means what it means to be in His image is that the true and genuine human experience, what it means to be human, is to be someone who reflects God's image, to be in connection with Him. That's what true humanity is meant to be. We're meant to be His image bearers, but we often choose to distort that, to define what is good by what we think is good for us, even if it's not good for the person next to us, and distort what it means to be God's image. And we push God out of our world and out of our lives. But God didn't want to be a distant God from creation. He chooses for Himself a people to be His light to the world, to be the people that show this image to the world around Him. And we read about this from generation to generation, where it's sometimes they do justice to this, and then they distort it for themselves. And to and fro, they reflect God to the world, and then they define good for themselves. And they reflect God, and they define good for themselves. And this goes throughout history until God says, I need to do something else. And then comes Jesus, the one who lives out this true image of what it means to be in the image of God, to reveal to humanity what true humanity is meant to be experienced and look like by reflecting God to the world around them. He comes and is the presence of God among us. Then in his death and resurrection, all sin is condemned and a new life is bought. So we're able to live life into this full experience, reflecting God to the world around us. What we're seeing through this is that God's interaction with humanity is moving from a point where it's just about a belief and an understanding in God to the person of Jesus, the physical person that walks alongside humanity, to now where we find ourselves living in this resurrection that Jesus has left, so he sent another who can come and dwell within you, the Holy Spirit, the bringer of the resurrected life, our new reality, our experience. This is the world we live in, the world of a resurrected life where God's presence is here to dwell in us and amongst us, our reality. We see this in John as we jump through a few verses today. In John 16, Jesus is speaking and he says, "Nevertheless, I tell you the truth, it is to your advantage that I go away. For if I do not go, the Helper will not come to you. But if I go, I will send him to you. And when the Spirit of truth comes, he'll guide you into all truth." The presence of God. Jesus goes so he can send his Spirit to be amongst us. Ephesians 1, Paul speaking, he says, in him, in Jesus, you also, when you heard the truth of the word, the gospel of your salvation, believed in him and was sealed with the promised Holy Spirit, who is the guarantee of our inheritance until we acquire possession of it, to the praise of his glory. God has moved from theology to person to the Spirit who is in you. The age we live now is the age of the resurrected life, the age of the Spirit. This is the age that Peter and Joel were talking about. So in Peter in Acts, when he's talking about this world, the reality of what Jesus has done in Acts 2, he says this, quoting the prophet Joel. He says, in those last days, God says, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my Spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. I'll show wonders in the heavens above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and billows of smoke, and the sun will be turned to darkness, the moon to blood, before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord, and everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. The last days, this is the world we live in. This is the days that we find ourselves in today, where the Spirit has been poured out onto the world and the reality of God is now at work within us, and we are changed. We are free. He's breaking into this world through us, through every relationship where we show love, through every interaction where we reflect God's image, through every environment when it's redeemed and transformed to be a place where you can experience God's presence. And the reality is that the resurrection isn't something to be remembered, but it's a way of life to be experienced. And this is our reality. This is the reality we live in, that we have this hope within us that even though we're fragile, that there is a greater reality for us. That even though we're broken, there's a greater reality for each of us. That even though we get pushed and crushed and get torn down, there is a greater reality for us. The presence of the Spirit, the resurrected life, the world that we live in today. And I'm sure we all know that feeling, don't we? The reminder that life isn't all that it was meant to be. When things fall short, when we've just had one of those weeks, you know, those times where we're pressed. If I'm honest, that's probably been my last week and a half for me. It's been really hard. The last week and a half's been really tough. Andrew's been on leave, and he went on leave at this time because I'm obviously about to have a kid, right? So he's taken leave to be able to free me to be present with my family in the coming weeks. And I think sometimes the events in life take the advantage of those moments to try to knock us off center. The last few weeks for me has been tough. I've had renovation pressures. You know, the challenges for those that have had family where you're just trying to get things ready, and then the foolishness of me to try to throw a massive extension on top of that. And that's been my last few weeks. For me and Megs, we've got a lot of prayer, and those last few weeks, you know, for those who've had kids, trying to get the kid in the right position to make for optimal birth. So we're in that stage. It's tough, it's painful, it's sleepless nights at the moment. I was at uni earlier this week, and in the pressure of all that, my lecturer's like, "Hey, Ben, you realise you were meant to hand an assignment in today?" That was fun. It's been a couple of big pastoral care issues, personally. With family, we've got a few family members who are sick, and my grandma's actually in ICU at the moment, not doing very well. It's been one of those weeks, right? It happens. Life is hard. It's a reminder that life is fragile. But the resurrection hope brings us a different reality, that in the midst of that, whatever it looks like, there is a greater reality that is accessible to us, a greater hope that carries us through. Corinthians would say like this, as Paul's reflecting, he'll go, even though we're hard pressed on every side, we're not crushed. Even though we're perplexed, we're not in despair. Persecuted, we're not abandoned. Struck down, we're not destroyed. We always carry around our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to the death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may be revealed in our mortal body. As we hold on to the hope of the resurrected life, not remembering, living it in the midst of the difficult times, it becomes a reality that begins to shine through, that people begin to see. I was trying to think what this looks like, and the only image that came to mind for me was, you know what it's like to go out at night and you look up at the stars. And it's against the darkest backdrop that we can see that we see the glory of the heavens shine forth. And when our life gets crushed and we get knocked off center and have these moments and the hope of the resurrected life shines through, people get to see it and see how amazing and powerful our God is. It's against the darkest moments that this hope shines. That we have a confidence inside of us that God sends his Spirit to us, and he's a promise and he's our inheritance that will hold us and bring this hope. And it's the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead. That's the resurrected life. Romans 8:11 will say, Paul's talking, goes, if the Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through the Spirit who lives in you. That while we feel deflated, while we feel defeated, cut down, worn out, we know that we can rise up again, that our hope rises because of the Spirit. The same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead is a reality in which we live. So I wonder what a situation looks like for you. Like if you can picture that moment or a moment recently in your life where the wind just gets knocked out your sails, where you feel like the air gets let out your tires. Maybe it's one of those weeks. Maybe you've had one of those. Maybe it's like mine, where maybe something you've hoped in or trusted in just seems to have now let you down. Whatever it looks like, there is hope because we have the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead living in us. We have a reality of a resurrected life that's our hope, the life of the Spirit. We see this clearly working through the book of Acts, don't we? The disciples, they lock themselves away. All hope's been cast out. Everything feels dark amongst them. And then the Spirit comes and he fills them and hope rises. But that's not all. It isn't just a hope we hold on to, that when the Spirit comes, he doesn't just come bringing hope, but he brings power. Power to rise again and power to, as he moves in us and through us, to validate the hope that he's got in us and to use that as a way to build up, encourage, and strengthen those around us. That this is our God and this is the reality we live. The message of Acts, I actually think, is quite simple. It says that the Christian life, the normal Christian life, is one that is filled with the Spirit, filled with this reality in which we live. Whether you're in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, or to the ends of the earth, when the Spirit comes, it isn't like he comes especially to these people or this experience and different to, it's the same Spirit who moves in the same way, who shows the same signs. He's not saying that everyone has the exact same experience. Paul talks about that. He says, no, you all get different experiences, but it's the same Spirit, and they validate that by showing it the same way. That when the Spirit comes, there's the same experience of hope, the same experience of signs and testimonies and power that comes through the Spirit. It looks the same because it's the same Spirit that lives in us, that even though we're hard-pressed, we're not crushed. Even though we're in despair, we're not cut down, because the Spirit brings a testimony of power in our lives and in our community as we build one another up in the reality of the hope in which we live. This is the normative Christian experience. It should be the experience we have of the Spirit in us that brings forth gifts of power so we can be a blessing to others, to grow their hope and their experience of the reality of the resurrected life. So if you read through the Bible, there's many examples of what this looks like, be it prophecy, healing, encouragement, discernment, tongues, teaching, hospitality, leadership. We can read it time and time again. There's any number of gifts that the Spirit does and brings to validate this experience of hope and to build one another up. The normative Christian experience is that we are experiencing an evidence of the hope of the Spirit in our lives. For the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead brings forth hope and power in our lives as we live out this resurrected life, the reality. We don't just remember, we experience. And the pathway to get to this life is that we need to move beyond remembering to living, into a lived experience of the resurrection, a life filled with the Spirit. And if I'm honest, again, that this isn't always the reality in which I live. There are moments, probably more frequently than I'd like to admit, where I forget. I can become too reflective in my Christian experience. The experience I live out of is so heavily dependent upon reading and reflecting that I end up chasing knowledge and understanding rather than a faith of living out of and experiencing God. I can forget that we have a living faith and a living experience of God available every day because I substitute that for just sitting and reflecting rather than walking in it. The resurrection isn't something that we remember that for what Jesus did, but rather a lived experience and an invitation that Jesus has for us every day. Every day. A lived experience of a resurrection hope, a lived experience of the power of the Spirit in our lives, and a lived experience where the Spirit leads us out of our community into the mission of God, of living out and witnessing Him to the world around us. You see, the resurrection isn't an event that just happened in history, but rather something that we join in the Spirit with every day. His continual work as God brings His kingdom and hope down around you, in you, and through you. Richard Rohr would say something like this. He would go that transformed people transform people. As we live in this experience of the mission and the Spirit of God in our lives, we become blessed so we can be a blessing to others. That through us, people are able to see, experience, taste, and touch the kingdom of God as they can see it in us and the Spirit moving through us. That we are Christ's representatives, Christ's ambassadors to the world around us. Paul would say it in Corinthians like this. He would say, therefore, we are Christ's ambassadors, as if God is making his appeal through us, and he implores us on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. Be my witness. Be my hands and feet. Be the evidence of the life that I have bought and I'm working in you to the world around you so people can see it, taste it, and experience it. The resurrection, it's a way of life where our lives become a revelation of hope and peace to the world around us, where people can witness and be built up upon by the power of the Spirit in our lives, where our lives reflect Jesus to the world around us. See, we, the church gathered together, his people, we are the plan that God has to reach his world, to transform his world as we partner with the Spirit in this resurrected life that we now experience, the life that he's made available to us. What that simply means is this: the resurrection is a way of life. It's what happens when our lives look like and continue the mission of Jesus in our world, as we experience that, as we live that, as we share that. And sadly, we often forget it. We distort it, both for me on a personal level, I think for the church in the world at large. We forget it and we distort it. We shortchange what God's called us to, what he's inviting us into. We shortchange this resurrected life for remembering. We replace living out the resurrected life for debates, for dogmatics, for religiosity, for repetition and just practices we do. And we forget that our lives are meant to reflect what Jesus was called to and what he was doing. Jesus, God didn't send Jesus into the world to condemn the world. He sent him into the world to save it through him. And if God didn't send his son into the world to condemn the world, I highly doubt it's his plan to send us to go and do that. God isn't calling us to do that. What God's calling us to is he wants us to go out and to live out and show as Christ's ambassadors what this resurrected life is. To live out of that as a way of life to the world around us, a life full of hope and power, to embody what truly is good news. What is good news for us? What is good news for our world? What is good news for those who know God? And he calls us to move beyond remembrance into the experience that God is calling us to, the experience of the resurrection as a way of life, or what he would call the normal Christian life, the life that's available to us all. I invite us, as we're about to enter into a time of prayer, in a season of prayer as a community, I invite us to close our eyes. Let's take a moment to reflect upon what Jesus has done. So let's close our eyes together. And in this place of this space that's created, this place we're in now, let's invite you to imagine. Invite you to imagine what it would look like to have a faith that moves beyond remembering. To have a faith that brings forth a hope when we are crushed. A hope that shines against the darkness. Imagine what it would look like to have a faith, to have power come to us when we are weak, that shows God to be great. What would that look like? To imagine what a faith would look like that's about living it out every day. A faith that's available, a life that's available every day in every area of our lives. What impact would it have if we lived out the resurrection as a way of life? Not just as something we hold to or remember, but a moment that changes everything. A reality that changes everything. What would that look like for us personally? For our families? For our community? Our church community, our broader community? If we as God's people lived out resurrection as a way of life, hope in him as a way of life, love through him as a way of life. Before the band leads us in our final moments of reflection today, and we have a time of prayer together, I just want to pose an invitation that if this is a reality that you'd like to experience, or that you realize that you may not be experiencing, if it's a reality that you desire, there's an invitation into that life. So I invite you to spend some time with God in prayer and connection, and perhaps you may need to deny yourself in this space. As we led earlier, as Cam put her hands and go, what do I need to lay at the cross? Do I need to lay down so I can step out in freedom into this way of life? Where do I need to deny myself to follow him? Maybe there's an invitation you need to give to the Spirit to say, come and lead, guide. I want to be connected with you into this experience of this life. Come, Holy Spirit. God, send your Spirit into my life as my reality. And there's an invitation to step out, to make faith not about our gathering, but to step out and to live like Jesus in community in our world around us. The resurrected life as a way of life. So Father, as a community, I pray over us all that we would be not just a people who are living in remembrance of you, but a people who are living in the experience and the reality of who you are. That we know that our lives are not perfect and that goodness isn't the definition of every experience, but that you are a God that is good, that brings a hope that triumphs over all seasons. That you change the definition for us and that you are able to work in us a hope that comes through the presence of you through your Spirit in our lives. Father, I pray that we can be a community that doesn't just reflect upon who you are, but that lives out of the power of what you bring, that we can be people of encouragement and building up and to be using your gifts and your passions that you put within us and the abilities that you give us to strengthen and to reveal who you are in our midst and to the world around us. And Father, I pray that as a community together, that we would be known for hope, meaning and love in our broader community. That we will be known as a people who are different because we have a different way of living, a way of living out of your resurrected life as our reality. So Father, I ask that you would be our reality and that you would extend grace to us, an invitation to us to walk in this every day. May you strengthen, build, grow, and reveal to us the resurrection as more than an event that happened, but as a way of life to be shared. Pray this